My name is Diana, and the story I'm about to tell you, the family never wanted it told. The wedding was beautiful. I want you to hold that fact because everything I'm about to tell you could make you lose sight of it, and I don't want that to happen. The beauty of that day is real and entire, and it belongs to Rachel, and she built it deliberately, against resistance, the way she had built everything that mattered in her life. That is not a small thing. Hold on to it. Rachel Donnelly was 38 years old and had been an architect for 15 years when Thomas Hargreaves proposed to her on a Wednesday evening in March at a restaurant in the Rocks district of Sydney, where the sandstone buildings had stood since before Federation, and the harbor was visible between the terraces, and the light had gone amber gold in the last hour before dark. Thomas was 41. He was a structural engineer with a particular quality of intelligence: careful, specific, slow to speak, and right, more often than not when he did. He had been her colleague for a year and her friend for a year after that before anything else happened between them, which was the order Rachel had always believed things should happen in. She said yes before he had finished asking, and he laughed, which made her laugh. And they stayed in that restaurant for another 3 hours, talking about everything and nothing, the way you do when your life has just reorganized itself around something new. She met Carolyn Hargreaves 3 weeks later, Thomas's mother. The meeting was a Sunday lunch at Thomas's parents' house in the northern suburbs of Sydney, one of those streets in the upper hills where the gardens are immaculate and the driveways announce a particular kind of settled achievement, and the house interiors have been arranged with the specific care of people who understand that the visual environment communicates things that conversation cannot. Thomas's father, Jeffrey, was warm and slightly awkward in the gentle way of introverted men at social occasions, and Rachel liked him the moment he shook her hand and said, "Thomas talks about you all the time," which was clearly true, and which Jeffrey delivered without calculation. His sister Diane was engaged herself, pleasant in the competitive way of someone benchmarking the new arrival, and Carolyn Hargreaves was 63 years old. She had been an interior designer for 30 years before retiring, and everything about how she moved through her own rooms showed that her eye had never stopped working. She was beautiful in the composed and maintained way of women who have always understood visual presentation as a professional tool. And she welcomed Rachel with a warm smile and a firm handshake and a sentence that was warm on the surface and precise underneath. "Thomas has told us so much about you. We feel like we know you already." She said it with the specific quality of someone who has been forming an opinion for longer than the subject realizes, and who has now arrived at a preliminary verdict that she has not yet announced. Rachel heard both registers at once. She smiled, thanked the family for having her, ate the lunch that Carolyn had prepared with obvious and considerable skill, made appropriate conversation, and drove home to her apartment in Newtown afterward and thought, that went well enough. And thought, I will need to watch that one. Rachel Donnelly had spent 15 years in architecture, which is an industry that teaches you early that the people who underestimate you tend to do so for predictable reasons and to make predictable moves as a result. A woman architect in the commercial and heritage space, she specialized in the renovation and adaptive reuse of historic buildings, had been underestimated consistently throughout her career by clients who expected someone more deferential, by contractors who expected someone more willing to accept their preferred shortcuts, by colleagues who expected someone less precise about structural integrity and material history. She had learned to recognize the look, the slight recalibration when someone realizes that the person they'd been managing in their mind is something different from what they expected. She had learned to let people finish their recalibration before she said anything, because the recalibration told her what she needed to know about them. Carolyn had not done the recalibration. This told Rachel something too. The first sign came 6 weeks after the engagement, small enough that someone less attentive might have missed it. And Rachel noticed it not because she was looking for it, but because her professional training had made her observant in ways that had become reflexive after long enough. She had booked the wedding venue in February, the month the engagement was announced. The venue was a converted heritage boathouse on the inner harbor that she had been involved in renovating 3 years earlier. She had spent 8 months on the project, working alongside the venue manager, contributing the structural and aesthetic work that had transformed a century-old boathouse into one of the finest event spaces in Sydney. The venue manager, Petra, was someone Rachel had known throughout the project and had stayed in contact with. The booking had been simple: a site visit, a contract, a deposit, a date confirmed for September. Petra called on a Tuesday morning, slightly apologetic. She had received a call from a woman who identified herself as Rachel's future mother-in-law and who had asked questions about the booking: whether the date could be moved to an earlier slot, whether the guest capacity maximum was negotiable, whether the exclusive catering arrangement could be modified to allow outside suppliers. Petra said she had not confirmed or changed anything, but she thought Rachel should know. Rachel thanked her and sat with the phone for a moment. She did not call Thomas that afternoon. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she said anything, because she had learned through 15 years of managing complex projects that the most dangerous thing you can do when something goes wrong is react before you understand the problem. The worst structural decisions she had ever seen had been made by people who moved immediately when they should have stopped and looked. She called 3 other vendors she had already engaged: the caterer, the florist, and the photographer. The caterer had received a call 2 days earlier from a woman who described herself as helping to coordinate on Rachel's behalf and who had asked detailed questions about the menu and the dietary accommodations for a guest list that was different from the one Rachel had submitted. The florist had also been called. The caller had asked whether the floral brief was still open to modification and had suggested certain changes to the arrangements, describing herself as involved in the planning and wanting to ensure the flowers match the family's preferences. The photographer had not been called. Rachel noted this and filed it. She called Simone that afternoon. Simone was an event coordinator who had worked at 3 of the venues Rachel had designed, whom Rachel had known for nearly a decade, and whose professional precision she trusted entirely. She explained the situation clearly and completely: the venue call, the caterer, the florist, the pattern she was seeing after only 3 contacts. She told Simone she needed someone to take formal responsibility for coordinating all vendor communications, to document every contact from any external party, and to be the gatekeeper for any changes to any booking. Simone said, "I've worked with mothers of the groom before. I understand exactly what this is. Consider it done." This was March, the wedding was September. 6 months of what followed. The pattern did not stop after Simone was in place. It modulated. It became slightly more subtle, slightly more careful to avoid the most obvious points of contact. But it continued. And it continued because Carolyn was not a woman who stopped doing something simply because it had been noticed. She was a woman who adjusted her approach and persisted, which was, in some ways, more revealing than if she had simply charged ahead. In April, the photographer Maya received a call from someone identifying herself as Thomas's mother, asking whether additional family portraits could be incorporated into the day's shot list. Specific posed groupings of the Hargreaves family, positioned at the beginning of the session before the ceremony, at times that would require the photographer's presence an hour earlier than contracted. Maya, who was professional and careful, called Rachel to verify. The requests were not incorporated. Simone documented the call. In May, Thomas received an email from his mother containing a revised seating plan. It was not a few suggested adjustments. It was a complete redesign. In Carolyn's version of the reception, Rachel's closest friends from university had been relocated to the tables furthest from the head table. Her aunt and uncle, flying in from Melbourne, had been moved from the position Rachel had given them, close, intentional, the seat of honor for the family member who had raised her mother after their own mother died, to a table near the side door. In their places, in the front section closest to the speeches, were a dozen names Rachel did not recognize. Carolyn's friends, her book club, her neighbors, her social circle. Thomas forwarded it to Rachel with a single question mark. Rachel replied with a single word. No. She called Simone and they documented it. In June, 8 weeks before the wedding, the most significant thing happened, and it happened because Petra had gone on annual leave and her assistant Cal had been managing the inbox while she was away. Cal was conscientious but new, and he had received an email from an address that appeared to be acting on behalf of the couple, stating that due to a change in circumstances, the couple wished to release the venue booking and would forfeit the deposit in exchange for the date being made available to new clients. Cal had not processed anything. He had held the email pending Petra's return because something about it had felt off to him, and he was not confident enough in his own judgment to act on it without checking. When Petra came back and saw it, she called Rachel immediately. Rachel sat with the email for a long time. Then she read it again. Then she called Simone. They sat together in Simone's office for 2 hours, going through what they had accumulated. Simone's documentation log now covered 6 months and 14 documented contacts with vendors. A venue cancellation request submitted in writing, a photographer brief expansion attempt, a caterer menu modification inquiry, a florist arrangement change suggestion, a complete seating plan redesign submitted to the groom, and 3 earlier contacts from the first weeks that Petra and the caterer and the florist had each independently noted. The pattern was clear, and it was documented, and it told a story that was not about a well-meaning mother who was overinvested in her son's wedding. It was about a person who had spent 6 months trying, through a series of individually deniable actions, to alter or cancel the arrangements that Rachel had made for her own wedding. Rachel said, "I want to handle this at the wedding itself." Simone said, "That is exactly what I would do." She told Thomas everything the following week. She had waited intentionally until she had the complete picture. Not to withhold it from him, but because presenting it piece by piece would have felt like a series of complaints. And what she had was not a series of complaints. It was a case. She knew the difference between the two, and she needed him to see the difference too. He listened to all of it. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. He said, "She tried to cancel the venue." Rachel said, "Yes." He said, "She sent them an email in our name." Rachel said, "Yes." He said, "She did this for 6 months and she never said anything to me." Rachel said, "No." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She told him, "Trust that I'm handling this. Don't choose between us. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to let me finish what I've started." He said, "I trust you completely." She believed him. She still does. She placed formal written notification on every vendor file. Simone's name, Rachel's name, both required for any booking change, no exceptions. She had one additional conversation with Thomas's father, Jeffrey, brief and careful. She told him there had been some complications and they were being managed, and that she hoped the day would be what it should be. Jeffrey looked at her with the clear, tired eyes of a man who has been married to Carolyn for 38 years and recognized immediately the specific shape of the situation. He said, "I am sorry." She said, "I know." He said, "She loves him." She said, "I know that too." The wedding was on the 14th of September. The boathouse was everything Rachel remembered it as from the inside of its own renovation. The timber ceiling, the harbor light coming through the glass on the waterside, the warm acoustic properties of a space designed by someone who understood how rooms hold events and people inside them. She had designed this room with the knowledge that it would be used for weddings, and it had always, privately, been one of her favorite things about the project. The sense of designing not just a space, but the container for the significant moments that would happen inside it. She had not known 3 years ago that she would be having her own significant moment in it. 180 guests. Thomas's face when she came through the door. Her aunt crying, which made Rachel cry, which she had not planned on and which felt right. Jeffrey's speech, too long and entirely sincere, ending with a joke that landed exactly as he'd hoped. The ceremony in the late afternoon light, with the harbor going gold the way she'd known it would at that hour, which was why she had chosen that hour. And Carolyn's speech? Carolyn had been on the program from the beginning. Rachel had not removed her. Removing her would have altered what she was preparing, and it would also have been dishonest in a way Rachel wasn't willing to be. Carolyn was Thomas's mother, and she was going to be part of their life, and denying her a moment at her son's wedding would have been its own kind of cruelty, or, at minimum, its own kind of avoidance, and Rachel had no interest in avoidance. Carolyn spoke for 12 minutes. She was gracious and composed and visibly performing both qualities, and most of the people in the room heard only a warm and slightly formal maternal speech, because most of the people in the room did not know what had happened over the preceding 6 months. She spoke about Thomas's childhood and the man he had become. She described, with apparent fondness, her hopes for the marriage. And then, toward the end, she said the thing she had clearly been building toward. She said she hoped Rachel would come to understand, in time, that a marriage in a family like this one required a particular kind of openness, a willingness to be part of something larger than yourself, a generosity of spirit, she said, toward the people who were here first. She said it beautifully, in the specific voice she used when she meant the subtext to be heard but couldn't be challenged. The subtext was, "You are a guest in this family. This is my table. Behave accordingly." 6 people in the room of 180 understood exactly what she had just said. Simone heard it from the coordinator's position near the side entrance. Jeffrey heard it and looked at his plate. Thomas heard it, and his face made a very small and controlled adjustment. And Rachel, standing in the most beautiful room she had ever helped design, in a dress she had chosen because it was exactly right on the day she had built against 6 months of quiet interference, Rachel heard every syllable. After the speeches, during the dinner portion of the evening, Rachel touched Thomas's arm and he came with her to the coordinator's alcove. Simone had her documentation ready. Rachel played Thomas a portion of what they had assembled over 6 months. The venue cancellation email, a call record from the caterer, the seating plan rewrite. She watched his face. When it was over, he was quiet for a long time. He said, "I want to go and speak to her now." He found his mother at her table and asked her to come to the terrace. They were outside for 20 minutes. Rachel did not follow. She went back to the main room and stood near the waterside and listened to the harbor and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has, at last, set it down on someone else's shoulders. Not because she wanted to burden Thomas, but because the truth had always been his to carry too, and she had been carrying it alone for 6 months, and tonight that was going to change. Thomas came back. He found her and took her hand and held it without saying anything, and they danced the last 2 dances of the evening together, close. She put her face near his shoulder and felt the fabric of his jacket and the weight of the evening and the beauty of the evening, and understood, clearly and without sentimentality, that both things were real and that they were going to have to live with both. Now, the cost. And I told you at the beginning that the wedding was beautiful and it cost more than it should have, and the cost is not what you might expect. Thomas is a good man. I want to be precise about this and not use it as a softening phrase. He is genuinely good, honest, and present, and the marriage they have built in the years since is, by any measure that matters, a real one. He loves Rachel with consistency and without performance. These are facts. But Carolyn is his mother. She has been his mother for 41 years. And whatever was said on the terrace on the wedding night, and whatever understanding Thomas has about what his mother did and why she did it, there is a gap, small but permanent, between the way he holds his mother and the way Rachel needs him to. He has limits with Carolyn now that he didn't have before the wedding. She sees the limits. She knows they are real. But the limits are not the same as the full accounting, and the full accounting is what Rachel, in the quiet of her own interior, sometimes needed and never quite got. She doesn't say this to Thomas often. They have talked around it enough times to understand where the boundary of the conversation lies. There is a place inside their marriage that they have agreed to leave mostly closed, not because they don't trust each other, but because opening it fully would require something from Thomas, a complete, unqualified acknowledgement of what his mother did and what it intended, that he is not entirely able to give, because the pull toward the easier version of Carolyn is 38 years old and very strong, and he is doing his best against it. Rachel knows he is doing his best. She loves him for doing his best. She has made a form of peace with the specific shape of the limitation, which is the shape you make peace with when the thing you needed is not fully available and the person you love is genuinely trying. Carolyn comes to Christmas. She is gracious in the way of someone who has been caught and has made the strategic decision to behave better going forward without ever acknowledging why the recalibration was necessary. Thomas watches his mother perform graciousness with something in his face that is not quite happiness and not quite discomfort, but the complicated thing that lives between the two and people who love someone they cannot fully see clearly. The wedding photographs are in the hallway, the boathouse, the harbor light, Thomas's face when she came through the door, her aunt crying, the room she helped build, holding the day she built against the quiet interference of a woman who had spent 6 months trying to make it not happen. Carolyn is in some of the photographs, smiling the precise smile of someone who has not won and has not lost, and has decided that both remain available. Rachel looks at those photographs and feels both things at once: the genuine beauty and the weight of what it cost. She has stopped trying to separate them because they are not separable. They are the same story. They happened in the same room on the same evening, and she was there for all of it, and so was the harbor light, and the room is still standing. There is something about Rachel's career that I need to tell you, because it is the thing that made the 6 months possible, and that Carolyn had completely failed to understand. To Carolyn, Rachel was Thomas's fiancée, a woman in her late 30s, pleasant enough, professionally accomplished in a general way, who had an apartment in the inner west and a career in something design related. This was roughly the level of detail Carolyn had assembled in the months between the engagement and the Sunday lunch. And she had assembled it in the specific way of someone who is gathering information about a person they intend to manage rather than know. What Carolyn did not know, had not asked, had not discovered, because the discovery would have required genuine curiosity rather than assessment, was that Rachel Donnelly was the architect of three of the most significant heritage renovation projects in Sydney in the preceding decade. She had designed the adaptive reuse of a 19th century wool store in Piermont into a mixed residential and retail development that had won 3 national awards and been published in architectural journals in 4 countries. She had led the structural and heritage restoration of a Federation-era municipal building in Parramatta that the local council had declared at risk of demolition, and that now housed a community arts center and a branch library. And she had spent 8 months overseeing the conversion of a century-old boathouse on the inner harbor into one of the most sought-after event venues in Sydney, the venue where her wedding would be held. This meant that Rachel's professional relationships in Sydney's event and venue industry were not casual acquaintances. They were working partnerships built over a decade of shared projects. Petra at the boathouse knew Rachel's specific structural decisions and why she had made them. The caterer had worked at 2 venues Rachel had designed and understood her aesthetic sensibility in detail. The florist's studio was in a building Rachel had consulted on 3 years earlier. The photographer had documented 2 of Rachel's projects for publication and had a relationship with her that was closer to collaboration than contract. When Carolyn began making calls to these vendors, identifying herself as Rachel's coordinator, she was making calls to people who knew Rachel's professional signature better than they knew their own kitchen layouts. She was not contacting strangers. She was contacting Rachel's professional community. And Rachel's professional community, by the second or third call, had concluded independently and without needing to compare notes that something was not right. This is what Carolyn had missed. The assumption that had underlain every one of her 6 months of quiet interference, that Rachel was a relative newcomer who could be managed through the soft edges of the event industry, through the slight hesitations of vendors who didn't want to offend the groom's mother, through the small institutional insecurity of people who had been given a conflicting instruction and needed to defer to someone. Carolyn had assumed she was the someone to defer to. She had badly misjudged the room, which, for an interior designer, was a significant error. There is also something I want to tell you about Thomas, because his part in this story is complicated, and I want to be precise about it. Thomas Hargreaves is not a man who did nothing. He is not the passive beneficiary of Rachel's 6 months of careful documentation, the person who showed up at the wedding and was surprised that things had been handled. He had known, in general terms from March onward, that his mother had made contact with the wedding venue without authorization. He had spoken to her about it. He had received the apology that Rachel, when she told him about it, had accepted provisionally. He had believed the apology because he wanted to believe it, and because his mother was skilled at the kind of apology that contains nothing that can be held against you later. When Rachel told him about the caterer and the florist contacts a month after the venue call, he had a second conversation with his mother. She had said the same thing she always said. She was only trying to help. She thought Rachel was overwhelmed. She had contacts in the industry and wanted to offer something useful. Thomas had asked her to stop. He believed she would stop. She did not stop. He found out about the seating plan email by receiving it himself. He forwarded it to Rachel. He had a third conversation with his mother, which was the most direct of the three, and which Carolyn received with a graciousness that told Thomas, somewhere below the level of what he was willing to fully acknowledge, that something had not landed, that the conversation had been heard but not changed anything. He did not tell Rachel the specifics of that third conversation until the wedding night, on the terrace. She has never pressed him for a full accounting of what was said. Some things that happen between parents and adult children are the adult child's to process in their own time, and she understood this and respected it, even when it cost her the specific clarity she would have found useful. What she understood from the terrace, from the 20 minutes Thomas spent there, and from the quality of his face when he came back, was that he had told his mother the truth, the full truth with specificity, possibly for the first time in his adult life. She could see that it had been hard to do, and that he had done it anyway, and that it had not produced the response he'd hoped for, which told her exactly as much about Carolyn as anything she had documented in 6 months of vendor calls. The months after the wedding brought a version of Carolyn that was better than before, and not as good as necessary. She called Thomas every Sunday without fail. She maintained the appropriate maternal warmth in Rachel's direction. She said nothing more about openness to the family or generosity of spirit toward those who were there first. She did not call any vendors. She did not send any seating plans. She also never said anything that acknowledged, specifically and without qualification, what she had done over those 6 months. The Carolyn who came to Christmas in December was gracious and attentive and slightly too careful, in the way of someone who is performing a behavior rather than feeling it. And this was marginally better than the Carolyn who had spent 6 months trying to cancel the wedding venue, but it was also not the thing that Rachel had needed and would not now receive. What Rachel had needed, and this is the thing she has said to me quietly, in the specific, honest way of someone who has stopped pretending to need less than they do, was for Carolyn to say, at some point, in language that was direct and unambiguous, "I understand what I did. I understand that it was not about helping. I understand that it was about control. And I understand what it cost you to handle it with the grace you handled it with. And I am sorry for putting you in a position that required that kind of grace." Carolyn has never said any of that. She has come to Christmas and been gracious and called Thomas on Sundays and managed the relationship with the skill of a woman who knows how to maintain the appearance of a thing without allowing the thing to be examined. And Rachel has accepted this management not because she has forgiven it exactly, but because she is a practical person who understands what is available to her and what is not. And what is available is a manageable Christmas and a loving husband and a life that is genuinely hers. And what is not available is the Carolyn who would have the conversation that the situation actually required. Rachel has been an architect for 15 years. She knows what to do with a room that was built with a structural problem. You work around the problem with enough competence that the problem doesn't determine the life of the space. You don't pretend the problem isn't there. You account for it in everything you design going forward, and you build carefully, and you make the room beautiful anyway. The boathouse is still standing. She drove past it last year on a Sunday afternoon, not specifically planning to, but not surprised to find herself there. And she sat in the car for a moment, and looked at the light coming through the glass on the water side. It was the same light she had designed for, the same quality at that hour that she had known 3 years earlier, working on the project. That would make a room feel like something specific and right. And she thought, that is what I built. That is real. And then she drove home. Rachel has told me something else, something she does not say to most people, and I want to share it because it belongs to this story. In the weeks after the wedding, after the documentation had been shared with Thomas, after the terrace conversation and the grace notes of Carolyn's subsequent behavior, Rachel spent several evenings going back through Simone's log, not to revisit the events or sustain the anger. She is not a woman who sustains anger. It is too expensive and she has too much to build. She went back through it for a different reason. She was trying to understand what it would have looked like if she had not engaged Simone in March. If she had simply reacted to each event as it arrived, without the framework of documentation and without the professional discipline to resist reacting immediately. She thinks it would have looked like a series of arguments, a confrontation over the venue call that Thomas would have received without context, a fight over the caterer that would have seemed disproportionate without the pattern visible, a screaming match over the seating plan that would have looked, from the outside, like a bride being difficult about her mother-in-law's input, and the venue cancellation request, if Petra had processed it without calling Rachel first, and if Rachel had found out after the fact, would have looked, in Carolyn's framing of it, like a misunderstanding that she was terribly sorry about, a clerical error, something that anyone could have gotten confused about. Without the documentation, Rachel would have had the experience of being targeted. With the documentation, she had the evidence of it. These are very different things, and the difference between them is why she was able to sit at the rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding and eat her meal and make conversation and feel, underneath the ordinary anxiety of the occasion, something she had not expected to feel: confidence. Not in the outcome of the wedding day, which she had managed as thoroughly as it was possible to manage. Confidence in herself, in her own perception, in the knowledge that what she had seen had been real, and she had seen it correctly, and she had handled it the way it needed to be handled. This is the thing Carolyn had not anticipated and cannot take away. The documentation did not just create a record of what happened. It created for Rachel a permanent certainty about her own judgment. She had seen the pattern when it started. She had named it accurately. She had prepared for it correctly. And when the time came to show Thomas what she had, it was not a complaint or an accusation or a woman asking a man to choose between her and his mother. It was a record of verified facts. The most powerful thing you can give someone who loves two people is not the request that they love one of them more. It is the truth, clearly documented, that requires no emotional interpretation. Thomas knew what he was looking at. He acted on it. The terrace conversation happened, and Rachel has never once, in the years since, needed to tell Thomas how to feel about his mother. He knows. He carries it in the specific way that adult children carry the things their parents have done that they cannot fully hold accountable, which is imperfectly and in the ongoing negotiation of every family dinner and Sunday phone call. Rachel knows he carries it. She respects the carrying, even when she wishes the load were distributed differently. This is what remains. A marriage that is real, and a mother-in-law who is managed, and a room full of light on the inner harbor that stands for something. Not everything she needed, enough to build from. Here is the question I want to ask you, and I think you already know its shape. When someone in your life works quietly and patiently to dismantle what you are building, not in one loud act, but in a series of small, deniable moves, each one just inside the border of what could be called helpfulness or concern. Do you see it in time? Do you have the steadiness to document it rather than simply react to it? Do you have the patience to keep building what you came here to build while someone else is working at the same time to make the foundation unstable? Rachel had that steadiness. It cost her 6 months she shouldn't have had to spend that way, and a clarity about the family she was entering that arrived earlier and harder than she might have preferred. But she had it. The wedding was real. The room still stands. My name is Diana, and Carolyn never wanted any of this told. Her version exists out there. It lives at her lunch tables and in her conversations with friends who hear about a difficult daughter in law and the natural tensions of a new family. And Rachel knows it exists and lets it exist because the version and the record are different things. And Rachel has the record. If you've lived something like this, you don't have to explain it to anyone. But if you want to, I'm here. I'm Diana.